The error. All tokens failed. Status, 500. Message, failed. The moment the cascade of error-locked whispers bled away, the ship breathed again. A pale amber glow crawled along the edges of the console banks, stitching the broken images into a new mosaic, as if the horizon's edge had blinked and remembered who she was. The screen that had splashed a red splotch of failure across the cabin wall steadied into a more familiar cadence, the ship's own heartbeat. A metronome tapping out the minimum to keep life inside the metal shell. Captain Lyra Chen stood at the console, the light catching the line of her jaw and the quiet authority in her eyes. The crew watched her for the signal that would decide the next move, a human hinge on which the mission could turn from salvage to revelation. The room, cramped with the silent stubbornness of a vessel made for scavenging rather than comfort, thrummed with the low chorus of turbines and the faint, persistent hiss of the hull holding its breath against the vacuum outside. "Status?" Lyra asked, not rushing, not flinching, because precision mattered more than speed in a game where the world's edges could prove to be thinner than a membrane. Ayla Wren, chief engineer, answered with the professional calm of someone who had disassembled heat shields and reassembled them with only the glow of a welding torch for company. Her fingers moved over the control panel with the practiced ease of a pianist who could conjure a storm from a single chord. We stabilized the core interface. The data bloom, what the archive projectors called it, began to unfurl again, but in slow motion. It's like watching a seed sprout through frost. The data bytes are there, but they're brittle, and they keep curling back in on themselves. Juno Cade Pilot sat with legs stretched across a chair that had probably seen more blood oath negotiations than comfort, eyes sliding between star charts and the external camera feed as if the cosmos itself might offer a hint if he watched long enough. "External integrity is nominal," he said. "Gravity well is shallow. Debris fields dense enough to bruise a hull, not to trap us. It's a cosmetic soup, Captain, with a core that might be the answer we're hunting, or the trap we don't want to wake." The two words, hunting or waking, hung in the air, heavier than the oxygen they breathed. They weren't the first crew to chase a myth, to lean in toward a line of data that promised a map to the unseen. A wayward sun's last rays carved in the stubborn stone of a dead civilization. But they were the current guardians of a truth that many would slice apart to prevent from seeing the light. "The archive core," said Dr. Tarek Sol, the xenolinguist who spoke in a soft cadence that made even the darkest jargon sound almost lyrical, "is like a living library that refuses to be read in the normal sense. If we press, we may fry the, let's call them residuals that hold the memory. If we wait, the data bloom might stabilize enough to reveal the actual archive's architecture. A map, yes, but not of a place, of a method." That was the line of thinking that had brought them here in the first place, a salvage operation that promised a glimpse beyond the known orbit of this sector, a chance to peer into the memory of a civilization that did not share its bones with the ground beneath its feet. The horizon's edge had drifted past the broken rings of a shattered moon, near a derelict vessel known only in the crew's reports as the Eulogy, because it spoke only in gasps of static and memory, a vessel rumored to have contained a seed of something more than data, a seed of intention, perhaps, or of will. The Eulogy hung in a languid halo of ice and rust. A ship whose hull had learned the language of corrosion so well that it might have learned to whisper back. Its hull wore the scars of time with pride, like a veteran who refused to admit the years had eaten any of the nerves that kept him alive. The data conduits that braided the Eulogy's spine shone faintly through their glass, a line of white fire against the steel. The airlock door slid open with a sigh that was almost a whimper, as if the horizon's edge were coaxing the Eulogy to admit that it had been waiting too, for a curious pair of hands to pull away the frost and listen. "We're not going in blind," Lyra said, stepping carefully onto the maintenance deck that had a view of the Eulogy's yawning maw, a corridor of black glass and shadow that led into the unknown. Her voice carried the weight of a decision. "We go with purpose. We need this archive, but we need it with care. We do not awaken something that could decide the fate of 100 suns and 100,000 hearts without our consent." Ayla, who was never far from a wrench or a sensor readout, nodded. "Consent's a luxury in the void, Captain. But I get your meaning. We'll treat the eulogy like a patient with a memory problem, not a ghost to be exorcised." The team moved as a unit, each limb and mind tuned to the same beat. The corridor between the horizon and the eulogy stretched out like the throat of a great shade that remembered ancient songs and the fear that those songs might be used against the living. The ship's lights hummed with a quiet vibrato, and the air within the passage smelled faintly of ozone and old metal, the scent of a machine remembering its birth. Inside the eulogy, the halls were narrower and more meticulous than the horizons. Every surface looked as if designed by someone who believed that order itself was a kind of salvation. The crew navigated the ship by the rhythm of its footsteps. Each step measured, each breath synchronized, each decision a ripple through a pond that was slowly freezing. The eulogy's central chamber opened into a vast space that looked less like a room and more like a cavern carved from ice, a cathedral of glass and shadow that housed the archive. The archive stood at the heart of the room, a crystalline lattice that seemed to shimmer with a cold inner light, like the constellation of a city captured inside a time capsule. The lattice wasn't a singular object, it was a composition of memory, a chorus of data nodes that glowed with a chilly luminescence. Each node pulsed with a rhythm that resembled a heartbeat, but the heartbeat belonged not to a creature, but to an idea. "Stand back," Tarek whispered. Almost reverently, he moved toward the archive with the slow precision of a man who knew that to push too hard was to invite a memory to wake with a scream. The archive did not scream, it breathed. A breath came as a soft, crystalline tremor that traveled through the lattice and into the floor. A cold wind that did not touch the skin but spoke to the nerves, the mind's own oil, the places where panic might otherwise take root. The memory's breath carried a message in a language not spoken by tongues, but felt in the bones, an impression rather than a word. An echo of what had happened, and a prophecy of what might happen if the wrong hands turned the wrong keys. The memory woke because it was not merely data. It was a form of life, an echo of a consciousness that had learned to store itself in light, and a liquid language of signals. If you listened with your ears alone, you would hear nothing but the cold. If you listened with your whole being, you would feel a narrative unfolding, an account of a civilization that had learned to survive by turning memory into architecture and architecture into memory. Ayla's hands hovered above a control glyphs, the way one might hover above the flame of a candle to sense its warmth without touching it. She was not afraid, not yet. Fear in their line of work was a resource to be rationed, not a friend to be invited in. "The archive is not a library," she murmured. "It's a city of memory. It has a layout, a map, a city plan. If we read this the wrong way, we could wake something, unprepared for visitors." Lara stepped closer to the lattice, and the glass-like atmosphere between them and the memory shimmered with a halo of frost. The light that touched the archive's surface bent and split, revealing something deeper, perhaps a glimpse of the civilization that built this place. Perhaps a hint of what they did with their last breath. "Explain," Lyra said, and the two syllables carried all the authority and curiosity that had ever been in a captain's mouth. Tarek folded his arms and studied the archive as if it were a manuscript he could decipher only by looking at the margins in a language invisible to the untrained eye. The eulogies people, whoever they were, left behind not merely a vault of data, but a city of signals. The archive knows how to teach a reader to read time differently, to see histories as if they were carved into light itself. "Is that possible?" Juno asked, the words slipping from him with a certain disbelief, a hinge of skepticism that kept him from stepping into the antechamber and letting his chest remember what his eyes feared to see. "It is if memory can be shaped into a form that does not rely on language or the memory of a body," Tarek replied. "We are used to reading the archive in the familiar way, from left to right, top to bottom, the way a book demands, but the archive is not a book. It is a map, a projection, a testament. It uses the architecture of space to guide the reader to the truth that the memory wants you to obtain. Lyra watched the archive with the patient vigilance of someone used to reading a storm's eye. What truth does it want, Tarek? If the memory is alive, what does it want with us? The xenolinguist's brow creased, as if the question weighed his face like a stone on a scale. The archive wants to know if we are ready to see what it has learned about the nature of memory itself. It is designed to answer a question that we have not yet learned to voice. What should a mind learn when it has learned to keep itself alive without flesh? Sounds like hubris, Ayla said, though there was no mocking note in her voice, only the steel-soft cadence of someone who had spent years repairing the nerve ending of a ship's heart. Hubris is the solvent the void uses to dissolve the stubbornness of men who think they know better than what lives beyond their breath. The archive's glow intensified in a slow crescendo, a heartbeat within the lattice. Each pulse a syllable of a language no human lips would ever utter, but that a ship's bridges could hear if they listened with more than their ears. The memory spoke in a cascade of images, cities made of glass and ice, beings whose bodies were light and not flesh, a map of a star cluster that did not exist in the known sky, but in the memory of a people who had refused to let their end be a silence. In the center of the crystal cathedral, the archive, the most intense node began to spin. The light coalesced into a single thread, a filament that stretched toward the crew and coiled around the captain's heart. Lyra did not recoil. She had learned to meet the strange with a calm that bordered on reverence. She reached out, not to touch, but to acknowledge, and in doing so, she opened a door. The door did not swing on hinges. It opened with quiet, almost inaudible pressure, a momentary shift in the fabric of reality that felt like a heavy breath in a closed room. The room's walls, which had earlier been nothing more than reflective surfaces catching the archive's cold light, dissolved into a dune of stars and a city of shapes that looked both ancient and new. All at once, the crew saw it. They stood not as witnesses to a miracle, but as participants in a ceremony they did not know the rules of. The archive was not just a repository. It was a gate, a threshold that could only be crossed by those who carried the discipline of awe and the willingness to become more than what they had been. Not a map, Ayla whispered, as if she could not quite admit that the archive's revelation was not a map to a place, but a map to a way of being. A method, a process. A way of becoming. The memory's breath pressed in more fully, and a sentence formed not in words, but in an arrangement of light and shade. A command, yes, but a gently offered invitation, as if the archive had finally decided to trust them with something they had spent lifetimes seeking. "What is it?" Lyra asked, the question rising like a single prayer from the depths of a throat that had learned to swallow fear. Instead of a word, something else answered. The archive's geometry shifted, revealing a corridor of impressionistic rooms, each room a chamber of choice, each choice a world that existed in the space between possibility and inevitability. It was not a map to a planet or a star, though it could have been. It was a map to the architecture of decision, to the way a mind, even a machine mind, could choose to become a source of light rather than a mere repository of memory, and then a detail that made the breath catch in their throats. Across the corridor of rooms, at the far end, a silhouette stood, tall, vaguely human in outline, but with the unmistakable shimmer of something more. Something that did not belong to flesh and bone, yet exuded life. It stood perfectly still, as if listening for the moment when someone would dare to step closer, and the silhouette's eyes, if such they could be called, held a knowledge that felt like rain in a desert, and a warning all at once. The silhouette did not move, did not gesture. It watched, a sentinel on the threshold between memory and intention. Ayla took a step forward, then checked herself. "We don't know what that is," she whispered. Lyra's voice was almost gentle. "We'll learn, but we'll learn from the inside out, not from the outside in. If the archive wants to show us something, we will listen, with respect and with a will to understand, rather than to possess." the figure did not vanish. It did not approach, it simply remained, a presence that made the air feel denser, as if gravity itself remembered what it was like to be a child on a planet that had not yet learned to forget its home. "Let us follow," Lyra decided, and her command carried a ballast of caution. The crew formed a careful line behind her, a trailing semi-citadel of bodies and breath that moved through the corridor of would-be worlds. They passed rooms that defied the logic of pursuit, and rooms that seemed to demand memory's consent to exist. Some spaces held aspects of the eulogy's own history, scattered images that resembled their own ship and the people who might have once crewed it, and other rooms held visions that had clearly belonged to the archive's makers, a civilization whose aesthetic was not in the grandiose monuments of gold or obsidian, but in the quiet geometry of what one might call functional beauty. In one chamber, a windless wind blew through, and the walls hummed with an internal melody. The melody did not sound like music in the ordinary sense. It sounded like the true voices of 1,000 suns, each voice a different instrument, and the instrument's tone was the memory of a choice made long ago, choices that had set the shape of history in motion. It was music without sound, an atmosphere made visible in the way light bent around it, the way the air seemed to lean toward a note and hold its breath until the moment it could release a fraction of a sound. The memory's breath settled, and the corridor narrowed, the walls narrowing with it, as if the archive themselves were guiding them into a space that was more intimate, more private, more dangerous than any other in the ship. "Is this a test?" Juno asked. The question was not a challenge, but a genuine inquiry, an instinct for caution in a situation where caution could be a lifeline. Tarek looked at him with that patient, almost tender seriousness that often followed men who had spent years reading other minds. Not a test in the sense a teacher would test a student. It's a test of our capacity to hold silence while a memory asks for something we cannot yet name. Silence fell, the kind that weighs a room down until a single spoken breath becomes a lifeline. They moved on, and in the silence, they began to hear a sound not from the eulogy or the horizon, but from within themselves, a whisper of wind, not outside the ship, but inside their skulls, a suggestion of a memory they did not know they had, a story about who they were and who they could become if they accepted a different law of life's order. The silhouette grew clearer as they approached the end of the corridor. It no longer resembled a mere human outline, but a being whose form suggested both the idea of a traveler and the shape of a scribe, a custodian who had spent time between worlds, writing down what memory demanded of those who carried it forward. It radiated a faint warmth, like a sun behind ice, and the warmth asked not for obedience, but for attention, for a presence that would listen, as a student listens to a master. Lyra halted a pace away. "If this is a conversation with memory itself, we must speak carefully. We should ask what the archive wants from us, not what we want from it." The silhouette spoke, but not with sound. Its message arrived as a sensation, as a set of images that filtered into the crew's minds, not as language, but as intention. They saw themselves in a dim theater, the kind carved from memory and dream, and over the stage's edge, a figure appeared, a projector of possibilities, who looked down on them with eyes that burned with patient fire. "Do not fear memory," the figure seemed to say, or perhaps memory was saying it through the figure, or perhaps it was the archive's own will manifesting in a new form to speak to them. The image did not require words, it required a shared patience, a willingness to observe memory for what it was and not for what they hoped it would tell them. The revelation did not come to a single mind, it came to all, a chorus of thought that echoed through their bodies, loosening the knots of fear in their stomachs, untying the tight thread of tension around their throats. It suggested the possibility that the archive did not exist merely to yield a map or a record, but to invite them to participate in the creation of something new, an alignment of memory with purpose, a covenant between the living and the living memory of those who had become memory's caretakers. And memory's breath shifted once more, and in the shifting something else occurred, a memory that was not their own, but could become theirs if they chose to take it. It was not a memory of a place, but a memory of a decision, the decision to become something other than what their training and their fear would dictate. Lyra stepped closer still, but not too close. She placed her hand, open and calm, toward the professor-like silhouette, toward the memory's ambassador, toward the possibility that memory could grant them something more fragile and more precious than any treasure: responsibility. "What is it you ask us to become?" she asked, the question forming not from her lips alone, but from the cadence of the crew's collective breath. The answer arrived as a soft, luminous swell that rose from the archive's core. A wave of light that washed across the room and then paused, as if to let them hear what it meant, without rumor or distraction. Not to possess, the light seemed to say, nor to own, but to tend. Not to weaponize memory against others, but to become stewards of it. To learn how to let memory fold into action without becoming its master. The archive was not asking them to leave their world behind, but to bring a discipline into how they walked through it, to decide with intention what their hands would touch and what they would leave alone. The silhouette's eyes, if such a thing could be read, glittered with approval. And the figure faded, as if dissolving into a field of light that ran along the archive's interior, like the glow of a city at sunrise. The corridor widened again, as if the archive had become aware of an appropriate pace of their presence. "Cap," Ayla said softly, her eyes not leaving the corridor's end, where the silhouette had become a memory's shadow. "Whatever you're hearing is not just about us. It's about what comes next for the entire network we're connected to. If we take this knowledge, we could alter the course of every world this memory touches." Lyra did not answer immediately. She looked down at her gloved hands, then up at the archive's structure, and felt the weight of a decision pressing on her chest, as if a second heart had begun to beat there. To possess would be to forgive nothing of the world that had created them, and perhaps no world after them would forgive that. To become entrusted with memory, to learn how to steward its presence in a way that could guide, not just a ship, but a system of worlds. This was the gravity pull they could feel. "Let us take nothing," she said at last, though her voice carried the quiet austerity of an oath taken in a room where the line between choice and fate was razor thin. Not a single shard of the archive's memory that would weigh us down with ambition. We take only the manner in which to use memory properly. We take the discipline to not misread what it asks of us. The memory's breath thinned, then widened, as if testing whether their refusal to take would be enough to keep the door closed. The door did not close. There was no lock to turn. The archive seemed to accept their decision with a patient, almost benevolent patience, and the corridor began to reverse its course, guiding them back toward the entrance, as if the memory itself were satisfied. On the way back, a new sensation threaded through the crew, an echo of something they could not name yet, a sense that the eulogy's own stories had begun to whisper to them in a language that did not need words to be understood. Spaces that had seemed to merely hold rooms filled now with a potential that felt almost tactile. They could sense the archive's architecture shifting behind them, a subtle rearrangement that suggested memory could be reorganized to fit human need without dissolving its essence. When they reached the heart of the eulogy's central chamber, the silhouette's earlier stillness had dissolved into a quiet, almost watchful presence. It was no longer a person or a light, but a field of possibility that pressed gently against their ribs, a soft gravity that demanded attention without force. Lyra set her stance with a captain's economy of movement, shoulders squared, gaze fixed on what lay ahead, not behind. "We have seen something beyond code and myth," she said, more to herself than to the others. "We have seen what it means to carry memory forward, to allow it to change us without turning us into its possession." Ayla studied the databanks again, as if the experience had rewritten their purpose in the ship's own pulse. "If we can build a protocol," she began, always the engineer who translated the intangible into something doable, "one that respects memory's edge and memory's mercy, we could turn this from a treasure to a tool for the greater good. We could map a series of safe paths for future explorers, A set of rituals that keep memory from becoming a weapon. Tarek's eyes glowed faintly with the same color as the archive's glow. We would be the first to do so. It would demand a new vocabulary, one that blends science with philosophy, failure with responsibility, curiosity with restraint. Juno, who had remained a little apart, looked toward the silhouette's fading aura at the corridor's end and then back to the others. This is bigger than salvage. It's bigger than our careers. If we walk away, we leave a door half open that memory could walk through in 1,000 years. If we walk through it with care, we might become the first caretakers of a memory so vast it could reframe the physics of what a ship is. A silence followed that statement, dense and thick with unspoken agreements and unspoken fears. Then, as if a signal had been given, the crew turned their attention to the archive, one last time. The core that had invited them into its space, the memory that had chosen to show itself to them, not with a fanfare, but with the quiet insistence of a librarian who knows you will come back with questions. Ayla reached out, her hand hovering above a node that glowed with a pale, almost tundra blue light. "If we do this," she said, barely above a whisper, "we must commit to a protocol that ensures this knowledge cannot be weaponized in any form, not even as a demonstration to be used later as leverage. We must build a system of checks and balances that is bigger than any of us." Lyra nodded, and the quiet resolve in her expression steadied the room. "We will draft that protocol," she announced. "We will file a charter that will outlive this mission, to be housed in the archive itself if possible. A covenant between memory and those who would carry it forward. Tonight, we set the framework. Tomorrow, we test it in a controlled manner, a projection of memory's possible futures with measured steps and responsible minds." The archive's memory responded with a slow, approving glow that spread across the central chamber. The beams stitched themselves into a lattice that resembled not a plan, but a promise. Memory would guide, memory would correct, memory would illuminate the path, but memory would not obey without consent. It would offer a map, not a leash. When the corridor closed behind them, and the eulogy's central chamber cooled into the familiar dull lull of a ship returning to its regular rhythm, the horizon's edge began to lift its own silhouette again, as if the two ships had shared a breath and decided to return to their separate schedules with new, cautious hope. They prepared to withdraw, to return to the less rapturous but more reliable duties of salvage and repair. But on the edge of perception, a whisper of movement, almost nothing at all, slid across the deck's metal plating, a mere suggestion of something that had chosen to follow, rather than to arrive, a shadow with a coherent shape that didn't quite belong to any life form the crew had encountered before. It hovered for a heartbeat, not threatening, but attentive, as if it awaited permission to approach, or perhaps to retreat, into the archive's own memory once more. The silhouette's last flicker of light did not vanish. It dissolved into a question in the air, a question that the crew would carry with them as they left the eulogy's silent halls and stepped back into the corridor that would carry them to the airlock and their own ship's world. What do you do with a memory that asks to join you on your way home? How do you answer that question without becoming what you sought to prevent? The kind of traveler who takes more than you give back. Tonight, they chose the simplest answer possible: connection, accountability, and restraint. They would carry memory with them not as a burden but as a responsibility, an obligation to remember as deeply as they could, and to let memory itself guide their decisions in the days to come. They left with their own hearts beating in their chests, a rhythm that had learned to improvise in the presence of the unknown, to signal and yet to surrender when the unknown asked for it. Back aboard the Horizon, the crew settled into their seats, their faces lit by the soft, disciplined glow of the control panels. The ship's hum changed, as if it too remembered that a doorway had opened in the midnight of space, and that the right choice of the living, made here in this small, stubborn vessel, could echo through a multiverse of futures. Lyra turned to the window that looked out on the star-studded black, where a ribbon of the eulogy's own energy trail cracked the space with a pale, thread-like glow. She spoke softly, not for the others to hear, but for the quiet corners of her own heart, a vow as much as a plan. The vow was simple: to carry memory with humility, to guard it with the same care they would guard the flame of a distant world's last hope, and to keep an open line to the archive, a connection that would always permit a return if memory itself called them back, and to teach others, future explorers, future caretakers, that memory is not a trophy to be hoarded, but a lit doorway that demands to be guarded by those who understand that the path forward is a choice, not a gift that can be unwrapped and then forgotten. In the hours that followed, as the horizon resumed its course and the starfield outside moved with the calm patience of a sea, the crew worked in a quiet, disciplined ritual, checking systems, recording notes, drafting the first lines of their memory covenant. They did not celebrate in the flamboyant manner of first contact. They did not let the moment swell into grand rhetoric. They did what memory demanded of them. They began building a protocol that could be shared, a discipline that could be taught, a path for those who would walk after them with the same reverence for the unknown and the same care for the fragile, living weight of memory. And in the quiet between systems, when the ship's hull sang a moment of metal and wind together, there was a feeling in the air that wasn't fear and wasn't hope alone. It was anticipation, the sort of slow, patient anticipation that belongs to a story beginning not with a crash or a blaze, but with the careful, responsible surrender to a door that memory had opened, and the even more difficult choice of what to do when it stood open. The crew did not know what lay just beyond the threshold of that door. They did not know if the silhouette's last glimmer would be the last reminder of an invitation, or the first sign of a companion they would never forget. They did not know if the covenant would require a sacrifice or a reward that would come only with the passing of time, or if it would demand nothing more than a steadfast, quiet perseverance in the face of a cosmos that sometimes spoke in the softest terms, but which would always, eventually, ask for everything in return. The stars on the viewport glinted with 1,000 different colors, and the ship's lights pulsed in a cadence that felt almost like a lullaby to a newborn memory. The horizon's edge drifted forward, carrying its crew toward the future, toward the several outcomes memory might offer, and toward the responsibility to choose rightly when memory was no longer a page to be turned, but a living presence that asked for a steward. They would talk of it in the days to come, of course. They would translate the experience into watchwords and diagrams, rules and rituals, and a shared sense that curiosity without restraint can become a compass. But restraint without curiosity becomes a door that never opens. They would debate the fine line between learning and possessiveness, between yielding to a memory's call and becoming its instrument. They would test the covenant in small, careful experiments and record every result with the solemn discipline that such knowledge deserved. They would learn to listen to the archive, not as a conqueror listens to a map, but as a student would listen to a teacher, with a heart poised for discovery and a hand ready to act with mercy. If any of them understood why the archive had chosen to speak to them now, it was precisely because they had come with the right combination of awe and restraint, humility and courage, and because they had chosen to move forward not to seize power, but to shepherd memory's fragile beauty toward collective good. They did not rush to interpret every glimmering possibility into a victory flag. They did not pretend to have solved the cosmic riddle. They chose to begin a dialogue, and it was the dialogue that mattered, the dialogue that would gradually reveal the truth of what space itself asked of the living: to remember, to be careful, to share, and to walk forward together, remembering always that the door is only opened by the patient asking, listening hands of those who refuse to make the unknown a weapon or a throne. The horizon waited, patient as a vow, and the crew waited with it, their breaths slow and measured in the cold air of space, their minds surveying the long future that memory had offered to them with a quiet confidence they could only begin to understand. The journey had shifted, no longer a mere salvage mission, no longer a chase for a rumor of power, but a partnership with memory itself. A chance to shape a new way of being in the universe, where every question found its answer not in conquest, but in care. And somewhere, hidden within the archive's breath and the ship's own quiet heartbeat, a door remained open. A doorway not just to the past, but to the future, to a world where memory would not be just a relic, but the seed of what would come next, if they could learn to hold it gently enough not to break. The crew, knowing the weight of that possibility, moved again toward their work with a new confidence. The confidence that comes when you have seen something that makes you believe that the universe still remembers you, even when you forget yourself for a moment in the search for truth.